Hey there, welcome to this video about performance optimization in Unicorn.studio. So we're going to start off looking at this example. You can find it in the community templates. It came from an exploration that I was playing around with for the new Unicorn.studio homepage. And it's just this kind of cool light bursting from this point over here on the right side of the screen. I built a mock-up in Framer and put this in the hero section, and when I loaded the page and kind of scrolled, it felt pretty janky and slow. And I had a good idea of why. You know, the biggest factor for performance is how many draws per frame. And this layer has a lot, and each layer here is firing on each draw call. But you know, it shouldn't really be that non-performant because it's basically just a gradient and some colors. This, you know, you could probably do this effect in one shader pass if you wrote the shader specifically to get this effect. But I decided it was time to build the optimization studio, which will allow per layer optimization and downsampling, as well as letting you do a couple other things to get the most performance out of your scene without sacrificing quality. I'm also going to talk about some other techniques like layer ordering and just kind of what goes on under the hood so you can better understand how to get the most out of your scene. But in this case, we have our very basic options here, like scale. This is just generally scaling the actual end resulting canvas and the resolution there. But we have this text layer on top, and we want that to look crisp, like the other text on our site. If we just downsampled the whole thing, the text would look blurry, and it wouldn't really give us the effect that we want. So first, let's just talk about how this shader pipeline works, from scratch. Each layer here from bottom up is going to render the previous result. So I can just go and hide all of these, and we can see what's going to happen in production. So each one of these is going to be at least one shader. The background is this interactive piece here. Then we have this noise pass. Then we wrap it with polar. We have our vignette, which gets this little section here. Then we have God rays. And then finally we smooth everything out with zoom blur. Both God rays and zoom blur are multi-pass shaders. So this one has, I believe, 3. Zoom blur has 4. There's built-in downsampling there, but what that means is there's 2 and then 4 additional draw calls for these two effects right here. So we have actually more going on than it looks. Then we have our text layer at the end here. The way to actually see in more detail what's happening is to go to your export window, and after you publish, you'll be able to see this optimize button, and that'll take us to the optimization studio. And what you'll see is a panel with a bunch of controls. We can sort of play with different things for our scene and how it might work on the page. Up top here with the preview settings. Then we have our render information. This gives us some interesting insight into how our scene works. So the first one is just how long it took the scene to render on page load. Second one is how many draws per frame. This is how many individual shader passes are happening. So one shader pass happens, then it passes the result to the next and the next and the next. And, ideally you want to have as few of these as possible. Each additional pass requires some memory overhead and will eventually start to drag your scene. I would say like 12 live draws is a lot. You probably want to stay under 15. Definitely don't want to be over 20, except for some circumstances. Maybe it's a small scene. Maybe you can optimize it really well. And then complexity score, this is kind of arbitrary. These numbers turn orange when they're in a zone that's not really safe, I would say. Frames per second, this is how many we're actually getting. So, on this laptop right now with this full scene, we get 120, but, this is 2021 M1 Max. It's generally pretty good. You're going to have a lot worse devices out there in the wild. You're going to have mobile devices, so you want to be conscious of not just relying on your own computer's performance. Frame time average and then frame time budget. The way we can think about this is that, the budget is 16.67, and this is just kind of our average FPS. If this ever goes over budget, we're going to drop a frame, and so we can track that for you right here. Below that is memory. This is, I think, an approximation, but gives you a good idea of how much texture memory is in the scene total. I can't really tell you what benchmarks are or like what limits are on certain devices, but just the rule of thumb is like you want this to be as small as possible. And then these are more kind of standard settings, like we have on the export window. We have scale, which affects the scale of the canvas size. You can really see this text get blurry as I sample that down. But right away you can see memory went from 300 something down to 4.88, and complexity score went down to 2.44. That's definitely the simplest way to just immediately get more performance. And what's funny is, like, you look at this gradient blur in the background, and at around maybe 0.5, like, the quality drop is unnoticeable. But I do see my text here has blurry edges. And so we're going to keep going down here, and I'll talk more about how to fix that. DPI, similar to scale, but is another way to just kind of get some quick and easy performance. A lot of the really immersive WebGL scenes you see on the internet are actually at 1 DPI. I like to do 1.5 by default, and that's kind of what's built into Unicorn.studio and the editor as well. Just because I think it's, for a lot of 2D stuff, you want crisp edges on your shapes and your text, and it's usually good enough. Frames per second is another way to, you can definitely notice the jitter, but it's a good way to, depending on the scene, to get some more frame budget. You see, if I drop to 24, my frame budget jumps up to 41. The likelihood that I'll drop a frame goes way down. Okay, so let's look at the pipeline. This is where we can really inspect and see what is actually going on each draw call in the scene. So we have this purple dot. That means that it is a live shader in the pipeline, and that it is drawing all of its planes each call, each frame. And here we have the resolution of that shader. And if we think about how shaders work, it runs the shader program each pixel, each frame. So each individual pixel goes through all that crazy shader code that you might have seen every single draw call. So one kind of cool thing is if we just drop the gradient, this is the very first layer in the scene, if we just drop the gradient to half resolution, we now go from the full viewport down to half. But there are 4 half squares, so we actually get 4 times the saving for just half the resolution. So there's this really great, economies of scale by scaling down by half. You get 4 times fewer pixels to have to render each frame. So what we're going to do is basically play with the downsampling of these individual layers, and see what kind of performance gains we can get without sacrificing quality. I'm just going to go half for everything except the text here at the end. Actually, the text at the end, we don't have an individual control for, because that's the output canvas. It's the last layer in the pipeline, which is basically this one up top, the scale. But this affects everything underneath. So because we want that crisp text, we're going to keep this top level resolution at full. And you can see that looks really nice, but we just halved the resolution of all the effects underneath it. And we are using just a third of the memory, and dropped our complexity score by half. So that's great. I think you'll definitely notice that, not only running on the page, but performance-wise too, because initially we have to set all these up, and then we're chaining them together each call. And this is an extreme example where there's no dynamic texture compressing because every single layer is animated. So we're really kind of like pushing the scene to the max. Ultimately, like I made some creations later where there were other ways of creating the same effect that leverage texture compression at runtime. So that's pretty much it for this scene. I mean, we can, keep going down here to see if quarter resolution, looks good, which I think it does. And we can see even like, so in this zoom blur, this second pass is 162 by 87 pixels. That's really, really small. But because of the effect, it doesn't need high fidelity if you're blurring. Blurs in Unicorn Studio by default have downsampling built in, but not as extreme as this. This is crazy. But depending on the scene, you might not even notice a drop in quality. Other places where this comes into play, where it's really useful, is if you have a pixelation effect as your final layer, or dither, or glyph dither, some kind of thing that really obfuscates the details. You should just really aggressively downsample everything underneath it, because you don't need that fine, 1.5 DPI resolution if you're just going to pixelate it, or something like that. So here, at this point, we have our crisp text on top, and we have our effect that looks pretty good to me, and it's about 10 times it's about 1/10 of the initial memory for the default scene. So that's a great example of just the power of being able to control the resolution on a layer by layer basis. And of course, when you like what you've done here, you hit save changes, this republishes, and now my scene, wherever it lives, will get those performance benefits. Okay, so I mentioned layer by layer compression, or, texture compression. This scene, you look at it and you think, wow, that's a lot of layers. That's going to be kind of a nightmare in production based on what's going on here. The answer is probably, unless we really downsample it. I don't think I would feel comfortable putting this, really big on a website just based on how much is going on here. But, if you want to do a video or other things, maybe it's a really small scene, you can do that. And there could be a more performant way to build it. This is just the most recent version I've done. You might recognize this. I believe the app is called Reflect, from the Reflect homepage. So the way to think about the texture compression feature is if we go and look at the pipeline here, and I've already done a little bit of optimization on this one, we can actually see that these first 3 layers, the dot is gray. When I mentioned that it's purple, it's running each frame. When it's gray, it only runs at load time, and then it just flattens everything and then feeds that to the first animated texture, which is this projection plane. The projection plane is what's making the space dust spin around. So we actually don't have to render all this stuff each frame, and while it looks like it's a ton of layers, and actually it is, it's not rendering all of them every frame. And just the easiest way to see is, where's the first animated or interactive. If something's tracking your mouse, it counts as dynamic, and it's going to render every frame. The first animated effect is where the render pipeline is going to start when we're talking about after initialization. Everything underneath that is going to just get smushed into one texture, and we're going to feed it to the first animated layer. So that's a really easy way to get some performance that you wouldn't expect out of a really big scene. Is, maybe I have all these crazy shapes and images and static effects, and on the top I'm just doing like a noise layer or something. It's going to smush all those layers down and only have one actual shader pass for the whole thing. So that's pretty cool. And if you think about, how that works, when you build your scene, you'll be building more performant and more efficient scenes. So let's go back here and look at this one again. This is an example of where, I don't have text on the top layer, but I do want to make sure that I have the right balance of performance and quality. You can kind of see, if I zoom in here, you can see some pixelation, but I'm willing to live with that, especially if the scene is, maybe it's like smaller on the page somewhere. That looks a little bit too crunched. But I think this is where the nuance comes in, where you can really play with DPI, you can play with compressing certain layers. If I make this space dust 0.25, for example, it looks super pixelated, but you might as well make everything underneath that 0.25 as well, because it's all going to get smushed down to 0.25. There's no point of having anything at 1 or higher. So definitely think about it like going from low to high as you move up the pipeline. Going from high to low, back to high, like, doesn't really do anything for you. Although that behavior is built in. Like, if we look at Bloom here, you're like, why are there so many layers? Like, that's how Bloom works. But you can see the built-in downsampling goes from 648 down to half for 4 passes and then back up. It's actually like doing some operations that take advantage of that down to upsampling again. But overall, if you're looking at your whole pipeline from a layer-to-layer basis, you want to think going from low to high is the way to do it. If I was putting this in a module somewhere on the page, 88 memory, 15 draws, still a lot, but this could work. And I think, with everything, you got to test a lot. You got to play with it. Try different devices, try FPS trackers if you have that. But, this, for at least your scene, gives you a pretty good way to control it as much as really as possible. There's other things like compress all your images as much as possible. And yeah, I think that pretty much covers everything. Thanks for watching. I hope you get some value out of this, get some more performance out of your scenes. And I look forward to, thinking of more ways to help you, without having to try too hard, get some really solid performance out of really cool creations. All right. Thanks so much for watching. Bye.